The surrender of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus on February 2, 1943 in Stalingrad marked a significant turning point in World War II. As he faced the harsh realities of winter and the loss of nearly 100,000 soldiers due to starvation and frostbite, Paulus chose to capitulate, a decision unprecedented for a German field marshal, especially shortly after being promoted by Hitler, who expected him to end his life rather than face defeat. This act of survival highlighted a grim truth already recognized by Germany's military leaders. The war was unwinnable. By early 1943, the inexorable logic of industrial warfare dictated that defeat was inevitable, not just in Stalingrad, but for the entire war effort. What is particularly unsettling is that Germany's generals were fully aware of this reality, but chose to prolong the conflict for another 28 months, enduring catastrophic losses at key battles such as Kursk and witnessing the downfall of territories, including Italy and France. They continued to fight on through the destruction of their cities and the suffering of their civilian population, ultimately resulting in the complete ruin of Berlin and the suicide of Hitler. This enduring question of why they continued to battle despite knowing their fate has perplexed military historians for decades.
To understand the pivotal moment for Germany's military leaders in the summer of 1942, we examine the early stages of Operation Blue, which began on June 28 with Army Group South advancing toward the Caucasus oil fields. The German forces executed rapid advances reminiscent of their earlier successes, leaving the Soviet army in disarray. German panzer divisions made extraordinary headway, ultimately raising the swastika atop Mount Elbrus by August. Concurrently, the Sixth Army, led by General Paulus, targeted Stalingrad, an industrial hub named after Stalin. Despite these apparent triumphs, a sense of unease gripped the German commanders. General Franz Halder documented this tension, noting that Soviet forces were not simply retreating, but seemingly organizing themselves for a strategic response. Intelligence from Colonel Reinhard Gehlen indicated the Soviets were forming new armies in the interior, raising crucial questions about their strength and intentions. Though reserves appeared undermanned, these insights were dismissed by Hitler, who was fixated on capturing Stalingrad for both its symbolic weight and potential strategic advantage. The battle for Stalingrad commenced in August with devastating air raids that decimated the civilian population and transformed parts of the city into ruins. The Sixth Army, augmented by the Fourth Panzer Army, initially made considerable gains, with German forces penetrating the city and optimistic reports predicting a swift victory. Yet, Stalingrad proved resilient. Under General Vasily Chuikov, the 62nd Army adopted innovative urban warfare tactics, maintaining proximity to German forces. This approach neutralized German artillery and air support, culminating in brutal close-quarters combat termed Rottenkrieg by the Germans as they fought for control of individual buildings at a staggering cost. Unbeknownst to the Germans, every day spent entangled in Stalingrad's ruins allowed Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov time to plan Operation Uranus, a counteroffensive aimed at encircling the Sixth Army. While German forces were drawn deeper into Stalingrad, the Soviets amassed a significant force of 1 million soldiers and substantial artillery and air support in the surrounding areas, employing deceptive tactics to mask their true strength. German reconnaissance was unable to detect the full scale of this buildup, and any warnings from intelligence were dismissed by Hitler, who was fixated on capturing Stalingrad for both its symbolic weight and potential strategic advantage. This false confidence would ultimately prove disastrous as the tide of the war began to shift against Germany.
Operation Uranus commenced on November 19, 1942, with a massive artillery barrage directed against the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad, leading to a swift disintegration of the Romanian defenses as Soviet tanks, primarily T-34s and KV-1s, penetrated deep into enemy lines. The following day, a similar assault targeted decimated the Romanian Fourth Army, causing widespread panic and collapse, resulting in Soviet pincers advancing toward Kalach. This maneuver threatened to encircle the entire Sixth Army, comprising over 250,000 troops, prompting Army Group B's General von Weeks to advocate for immediate withdrawal. However, General Paulus of the Sixth Army hesitated and sought orders from Hitler, who, on November 22, commanded the troops to hold their position in Stalingrad and prepare for a defensive stance, banking on Luftwaffe's air supply to sustain them. The Luftwaffe, under Göring's assurances, was supposed to deliver 700 tons of supplies daily, a promise deeply flawed given past failures. On November 23, the Soviet forces completed their encirclement, effectively sealing the Sixth Army's fate due to Hitler's refusal to allow a breakout. In late November, opportunities for retreat remained as the Soviet lines were disorganized. A breakout plan was stymied by Hitler's orders, tying Paulus's hands. The German relief operation, Operation Winterstorm, launched on December 12, aimed to cut through Soviet encirclements. Field Marshal von Manstein insisted that once the relief force penetrated near the Sixth Army, they must break out. The 4th Panzer Army initially succeeded, advancing significantly. However, another order from Hitler prevented any breakout, leaving the soldiers in Stalingrad. Manstein warned that the situation was deteriorating rapidly, but his appeals to Hitler went unheeded. By December 23, Soviet counterattacks forced a retreat of the relief troops, and any hope for the Sixth Army was extinguished. The dire conditions persisted, with insufficient supplies, only 94 tons delivered daily, resulting in severe starvation among troops, with rations reduced drastically. Soldiers faced frostbite, starvation, and rampant dysentery, leading to dire circumstances as they awaited a spring that would never come, only enduring cold, hunger, and imminent death.
The text recounts the dire circumstances faced by the German Sixth Army during the Battle of Stalingrad, where wounded soldiers remained unevacuated as the Luftwaffe prioritized ammunition resupply over medical evacuation. This led to horrendous conditions, with soldiers enduring extreme cold and injury, unsure of their fate. Back at Hitler's headquarters, the generals, including General Kurt Seitzler, grappled with the catastrophic situation, realizing that Hitler's military interference was detrimental to their efforts. Seitzler, who reduced his rations to mirror those of the trapped soldiers, exemplified their despair as he suffered significant weight loss, reflecting the dire need for strategic change. As the siege continued, the generals increasingly doubted Hitler's military acumen, recognizing him not as a genius, but as a reckless gambler refusing to face the grave reality of their circumstances. The culmination of this realization built up gradually among the senior ranks, with prominent figures like Field Marshal von Manstein criticizing Hitler's rigid strategy of holding ground at all costs, which ultimately threatened the integrity of the German army. By January 10, 1943, as the Soviets prepared for a final assault on Stalingrad, they issued a surrender ultimatum that was angrily rebuffed by Hitler, who insisted that the Sixth Army fight to the last soldier. The Soviet offensive commenced with overwhelming artillery fire and a well-coordinated infantry assault that quickly dismantled the beleaguered German defenses. As of January 25, 1943, the encirclement was complete and communications between the remnants of the Sixth Army dissolved. Despite being granted a promotion to Field Marshal, an honor that carried ominous implications, Paulus recognized the futility of continuing the fight and ultimately surrendered on February 2, 1943. The staggering loss of life included around 285,000 German and Romanian troops trapped, with about 40,000 evacuated, most subsequently dying, and 190,000 falling into Soviet hands, very few of
of whom would ever return home. The Battle of Stalingrad represented not only a grim tactical defeat, but also a strategic catastrophe for the Wehrmacht, exposing the vulnerabilities of their southern front and leading to the further operations that decimated the Italian and Hungarian armies. By February 1943, German positions along an expansive front had collapsed, undoing the territorial gains made in 1942. Most critically, the belief in the possibility of a German victory in the war was fundamentally shaken.
In early 1943, the Wehrmacht's senior ranks were increasingly aware of their dire military situation. They recognized the significant losses facing Germany, assessed through various factors such as intelligence reports about Soviet production and the ongoing conflicts in Tunisia and the Atlantic. The harsh realities were underscored by stark comparisons in military production between the Soviet Union and Germany. In 1942, the Soviets produced 24,700 tanks against Germany's 9,300, and significantly more combat aircraft as well. This production gap continued to widen, compounded by the Soviets' full economic mobilization for war, while Germany's industries were exposed to Allied bombings. The emergence of American industrial power further complicated the scenario for Germany. In 1942, the United States manufactured 47,800 aircraft and 10,800 tanks, with projections of dramatic increases in the following years that Germany could not rival. General Georg Thomas had warned prior to the war that Germany needed a swift victory or access to Soviet resources to sustain a prolonged conflict. With neither option viable, it became clear that Germany was at a disadvantage. Despite this knowledge, the German generals continued to fight, driven by varied motivations. Loyalty to Hitler was waning, professional duty played a role, and fear of repercussions for opposing the regime was significant. The possibility of negotiating a peace settlement, rather than enduring an unconditional surrender, was a compelling reason for some. However, a pervasive fear of Soviet revenge also influenced their resolve. Many officers feared the repercussions of a Soviet victory, given the brutal conduct of the Red Army and the chilling propaganda that urged violence against all Germans. Moreover, there were those who speculated on a potential rift between the Soviets and the Western Allies that might allow Germany to negotiate a peace. Historical contexts, such as Churchill's anti-communist stance in the 1930s, fueled this speculation. Yet this reasoning ignored the definitive Allied stance established at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, where unconditional surrender was affirmed as the only acceptable outcome for Axis powers. Despite the grim outlook and the lack of competitive resources, the German military machinery persisted in its campaign, resulting in ongoing bloodshed as preparations commenced for a transitional period following the winter battles of early 1943, leading to a stabilized front line. This situation highlighted the complex interplay between duty, fear, and desperation within the Wehrmacht amidst an unwinnable war.
Operation Citadel marked Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front during World War II, initiated on July 5, 1943, aimed at eliminating a large Soviet salient around Kursk. By March, this salient, stretching 120 miles at its base and extending 70 miles into German territory, had already drawn the attention of Hitler and his generals, who devised a plan involving two panzer armies to encircle and trap Soviet forces. The offensive was to deploy nearly 1 million men, 2,700 tanks, and 10,000 artillery pieces, showcasing the largest concentration of German armor ever assembled. However, the operation faced significant delays as Hitler opted to await the availability of new Panther and Tiger tanks to provide a technological edge. These delays allowed the Soviet Union to strengthen its defenses, creating extensive fortifications, minefields, and artillery positions that would pose substantial challenges for the German advance. Despite the opposition from General Heinz Guderian, who warned of heavy casualties and minimal gains, Hitler remained emotionally committed to executing the operation to regain German prestige.
The offensive unfolded with the northern pincer, led by General Model, facing immediate difficulties due to robust Soviet defenses, achieving only a 6-mile penetration after a week, which indicated a failure of the northern approach. In contrast, the southern pincer, under Manstein, initially succeeded in advancing more effectively and engaged in the historic Battle of Prokhorovka, where both sides suffered significant losses. Although the Germans lost fewer tanks, the Soviets managed to halt the advance of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and subsequently launched a counteroffensive, posing a new threat to German lines. On July 13, 1943, under increasing pressure from the situation in Sicily, Hitler canceled Operation Citadel, despite protests from Cluj and Manstein, who believed they could still secure a victory. Ultimately, the foresight of the Soviet defenses proved to be more resilient than the German High Command anticipated, marking a significant turning point in the Eastern Front operations. The Soviets improved tactical capabilities, shifting away from the concentration of forces in vulnerable positions, further indicated the changing tide of war. In the wake of significant military engagements, the German Wehrmacht found itself at a turning point following the failed Operation Citadel in 1943. Although capable of winning tactical battles, the Wehrmacht could no longer execute operational campaigns, resulting in tactical victories that held little meaning without broader successes. This period marked a substantial shift in German military psychology, with the realization that there would be no further grand offensives. Instead, a defensive war began, aimed at holding back Soviet advances and clinging to the hope of a negotiated peace, despite the unlikelihood of such an outcome. The Soviet Union, having significantly bolstered its military capabilities since 1941, was poised to launch a relentless counteroffensive after the battle at Kursk. The Red Army's numbers reached around 6 million frontline troops, supported by an additional 4 million in reserves. Their operational art allowed for extraordinary coordination and artillery production, outmatching the German forces. At Kursk, the concentration of Soviet artillery overwhelmed German defenses, shattering their lines. By late 1943, the Soviets had liberated key cities such as Orel, Belgorod, and Smolensk, and after crossing the Dnieper River multiple times, the Red Army continued its rapid advance, with significant territorial gains anticipated towards Berlin. Simultaneously, the Mediterranean front reflected dire circumstances for Germany. The surrender of the Afrika Korps in Tunisia and Italy's subsequent capitulation in September without cessation of fighting against German occupation underscored the relentless Allied push. The British and Canadian forces advanced steadily up the Italian coast, despite fierce German resistance. Domestically, Germany was under siege as Allied bombing campaigns intensified, beginning with area bombing in 1942 and escalating into 1943 with devastating raids like Operation Gomorrah on Hamburg. These assaults on urban industrial centers resulted in massive civilian casualties and loss of production capacity. German air defenses struggled to compensate, leading to a critical loss of air superiority over German territory. These compounding military defeats solidified the belief among many German generals that the war was lost, albeit with reluctance to confront the reality of total defeat. The military culture, bound by a strict oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler rather than to the German state, created a hesitant climate for dissent. The consequences of opposing Hitler were severe, as defeatist officers faced execution by the Gestapo. However, despite the risks involved, a faction within the military began to form. This coalition sought to remove Hitler, advocating for negotiations with the Western Allies in hopes of securing a peace settlement that was more favorable to Germany.
The key figures in the conspiracy against Hitler included Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, General Friedrich Albrecht, Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, and Major General Henning von Tresckow, who were driven by patriotism and a desire to save Germany from total destruction rather than defeatism. Recognizing that simply killing Hitler Hitler would not suffice. They devised Operation Valkyrie, which aimed to take control of the government and military, neutralize the SS, and negotiate peace with the Allies. This plan proposed activating emergency procedures under the pretext of an SS coup, enabling army units to seize critical locations and establish a new government of respected leaders, ready to announce Hitler's death and pursue peace terms. The conspirators were aware that the Allies would likely demand Germany's unconditional surrender, necessitating the relinquishment of conquered territories and facing potential war crimes charges. However, they held out hope that a post-Hitler regime might secure better terms and avert catastrophic outcomes like total destruction, mass starvation, or extensive Soviet occupation. This optimism was arguably misplaced, as the Casablanca Declaration had established a policy of unconditional surrender, and the Allies were unlikely to differentiate between a Germany without Hitler and one with him due to the Wehrmacht's involvement in numerous atrocities and the lessons learned from World War I about the dangers of negotiated peace. Multiple assassination attempts against Hitler in 1943 failed due to various factors, including bad luck and operational challenges. The conspiracy struggled for broader support among senior military officers for several reasons. Some believed in the necessity to continue fighting until officially ordered to cease, while others feared the consequences of failure, which could result in severe repercussions from the SS. Additionally, some officers clung to hopes for a change in the war's dynamics, such as a fracture in the Allied coalition or the potential effectiveness of Germany's new weaponry. Hitler's deteriorating military strategy stemmed from a catastrophic misjudgment of Allied resolve, stemming from his belief that democracies were inherently vulnerable to war fatigue. Despite Germany's losses in material and manpower, he maintained that spiritual strength contributed by National Socialism could outlast the Allies. However, this ideology trapped military leadership, which faced Hitler's dictatorial control over strategy and increasingly blamed setbacks on the general's lack of determination. This cycle of defeat and rigid control ultimately intensified through the summer of 1944, leading to a critical crisis.
On June 23, 1944, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, a monumental offensive against Army Group Center in Belarusia, coinciding with the third anniversary of the German invasion. This operation, the largest of the war, deployed over 2 million Soviet troops and 5,700 tanks along a 400-mile front, facing approximately 800,000 German defenders with 900 tanks. Hitler's refusal to allow a strategic withdrawal exacerbated the German plight, leading to catastrophic losses. Within a week, Soviet forces breached the German front and encircled key formations, resulting in the destruction of the 3rd Panzer Army and severe casualties. About 400,000 German personnel and over 2,000 tanks lost. Unlike Stalingrad, this defeat was less publicized due to the absence of a dramatic siege. Instead, it was marked by the complete collapse of an entire army group. The psychological impact on the German command was profound. Bagration highlighted the Red Army's ability to undertake complex, multi-front operations, showcasing a dramatic shift in military efficacy. As Soviet mobile forces advanced nearly 400 miles, liberating Belarusia and threatening Germany itself. Concurrently, the Western Allies executed the D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, but initially faced resistance. However, following Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944, American forces penetrated German lines near Saint-Lô, rapidly advancing through Brittany. A counteroffensive by the Germans on August 7th failed disastrously, leading to significant casualties, including 50,000 captured and 10,000 killed in the Falaise pocket. By mid-August, Germany found itself encumbered by a three-front war against the Soviets in the east, the Western Allies in France and Anglo-Americans in Italy, with no strategic reserves to bolster efforts on each front. The transportation network deteriorated due to relentless Allied air attacks, oil production plummeted, and the imminent loss of Romania, Germany's chief petroleum source, fueled the likelihood of further military immobilization. Amid this turmoil, Colonel von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler on July 20, 1944, using a bomb he placed in a briefcase at a military conference. Although the explosion killed 4 men, Hitler survived with minor injuries. Following the assassination attempt, the conspirators initiated Operation Valkyrie, falsely announcing Hitler's death and attempting to seize control. The plot faltered when news of Hitler's survival spread, leading to the coup's collapse within hours, and the subsequent execution of Stauffenberg and key conspirators. The failure marked a definitive end to any internal attempts to steer Germany toward peace. Hitler responded by tightening his grip on the military hierarchy and executing suspect officers in a brutal purge that eliminated dissent and instilled fear within the ranks. He formed new military groups like the Volkssturm, comprised of older men and boys, and decreed that Germany would fight until the end, resolute that if the nation were to perish, it would take as many enemies with it as possible.
The Wehrmacht faced internal disintegration as its command structure succumbed to the pressures of impending defeat, particularly after Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945. Admiral Karl Donitz, who succeeded Hitler, sought to prolong the war momentarily to facilitate escape for German forces and civilians from the Soviet advance. He dispatched Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg to negotiate a separate surrender with the Western Allies, aiming for a Western Front capitulation while continuing to combat the Soviets. However, the Allies demanded unconditional surrender on all fronts. This culminated in General Alfred Jodl signing the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims on May 7, 1945, marking the conclusion of the European theater of World War II. The refusal to surrender earlier had dire repercussions, particularly in the war's final year, summer 1944 to May 1945, during which Germany experienced unprecedented casualties. Approximately 3 million German military personnel lost their lives, alongside around 2 million civilian casualties attributed to bombing raids, starvation, disease, and the chaos of fleeing from advancing Soviet forces. Destruction of German cities, such as the firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 that killed 25,000 civilians shortly before the war's end, exacerbated the humanitarian crisis. The Holocaust also intensified during this period, as the SS strove to eliminate evidence of their atrocities, while Nazis forcibly marched remaining prisoners from camps like Auschwitz, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths. Notably, about half of all Holocaust deaths occurred within the last 18 months of the war, suggesting that an earlier surrender could have potentially saved millions of lives. The responsibility for the catastrophic loss of life is complex and fraught with moral implications. Hitler bears ultimate accountability due to his initiation of the war, rejection of negotiations, and order to continue genocidal policies amidst Germany's collapse. Nonetheless, German generals who executed his orders also carry significant responsibility, aware that prolonging the war entailed immense suffering for millions. Their motivations, including professional duty, fear, and a desire to shield German civilians from Soviet retribution, do not entirely justify their continued resistance. Some historians argue that the generals were essentially trapped by the circumstances following the failed July 20 assassination attempt against Hitler, with the SS's surveillance, Hitler's oath, and subsequent purges making opposition perilous. However, others contend that military defiance against genocidal orders, while rare, is not unheard of. The inability to refuse orders or to initiate surrenders reflects deeply ingrained military culture and nationalist sentiments, with a troubling undercurrent that some generals participated in the
war efforts due to shared goals with Hitler, such as territorial expansion and dominion over Slavic peoples. Post-war narratives from Germany often depicted the German populace as victims of Hitler's regime, portraying military leadership as unthinking followers without moral culpability, which masked the Wehrmacht's active involvement in war crimes. This narrative, while comforting, is historically flawed. Recent scholarship, particularly by historians like Wolfram Wette and Manfred Messerschmitt, has challenged the notion of a clean Wehrmacht, revealing its extensive complicity in Nazi crimes, thus reframing the understanding of the German military's role in the war and the consequences of their choices.
But this clearer historical understanding raises profound questions about military institutions. The Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes and the knowledge among its leaders that the war was lost challenged the concept of military duty versus moral responsibility. The Nuremberg trials established that following orders does not exempt individuals from war crimes. However, the dilemma of whether soldiers should refuse orders in a hopeless conflict remains. Between 1943 and 1945, German generals faced dire choices, shaped by their previous support of Hitler and the regime's crimes, which constrained their options. By the time they recognized the inevitability of defeat, they were caught in a web of oaths, ideology, fear, and guilt over their actions. The latter years of the war saw military operations that had no strategic impact. They merely prolonged suffering and destruction. The generals continued to fight despite knowing the war was lost, leading to immense casualties and the devastation of Germany itself. Their struggle through significant battles like Stalingrad, Kursk, and the invasion of Normandy underscored a tragic reality. Each engagement was futile, only serving to delay the inevitable fall of Germany. As they witnessed their cities reduced to ruins and their armies annihilated, these military leaders remained in denial about the implications of their ongoing participation in the conflict. The gradual realization of Germany's defeat instilled in the generals a deeper psychological conflict. They were not simply villains. Rather, they were professional soldiers ensnared in a historical tragedy of their creation. Their continued engagement in the war was not merely a refusal to acknowledge military loss, but also a means to avoid confronting their moral failure. Accepting responsibility for the devastation inflicted upon countless lives would have shattered their identities as soldiers. Ultimately, the persistence of Germany's generals, even after recognizing the war's futility, offers a disconcerting illustration of the limits of military professionalism. Their institutional loyalty, adherence to authority, and pride continued to guide them, even as rational justification evaporated. The experience illustrates that military prowess does not guarantee the discernment necessary to realize when to cease combat. The real menace within military ranks can stem from those skilled yet lacking the moral fortitude to refuse unethical commands. The central knowledge that Germany had already lost, instead of propelling action to halt the violence, culminated in an additional 28 months of senseless slaughter. This failure to act in light of their understanding stands as one of World War II's most unsettling legacies, emphasizing the crucial importance of moral courage alongside military competence. The German generals ultimately exemplified individuals burdened by a deep tragedy, skilled, brave, and yet tragically blind to the destructive path they chose to follow.
A warning is issued regarding the dangers of military professionalism devoid of moral reasoning, emphasizing the need to question orders rather than follow them blindly. The generals overseeing Germany's final collapse, despite their exceptional military abilities, became increasingly trapped by their own excellence, having mastered tactics and strategy while neglecting the fundamental purpose of humanity. Though dedicated to their nation, they witnessed unspeakable evil and consistently chose professional duty over moral responsibility. a choice documented through personal writings of German officers who expressed profound doubts and justifications for their actions. Field Marshal von Manstein articulated a constant moral dilemma faced by generals, whether their continued service could mitigate greater disasters, or whether resignation would exacerbate the situation by empowering more radical factions. While some officers might have prevented worse outcomes by their presence, such justifications cannot absolve the choice to serve a regime engaged in systematic genocide and a lost war. These officers, though not evil themselves, reflected a military culture prioritizing obedience over moral initiative, valuing loyalty to authority over ethical reasoning. Their training focused on military effectiveness without critical questioning of the war's legitimacy, which, according to the Wehrmacht's institutional ethos, discouraged any political accountability and portrayed dissent as defeatist. The legal binding nature of their oath to Hitler effectively stifled any political decision-making, leading to complicity in genocide. A pivotal question arises about the threshold at which continued service became inexcusable, with historians differing on their views. Some cite Stalingrad, Kursk, or the failed July 20th plot as critical moments, while others argue the moral failing might have occurred earlier with the onset of recognized Nazi atrocities. Ultimately, there exists consensus that these generals transitioned from tragic figures enmeshed in impossible circumstances to active participants in catastrophe, trading professional duty for complicity in evil. This historical context poses a lasting question for militaries. When should soldiers refuse orders from civilian authorities? The response is complex. An absolute stance of never disregarding orders might invoke the Nuremberg defense, while an unrestricted refusal risks military insubordination and instability. Lessons from the actions of German generals between 1943 and 1945 informed that when commands result in genocide or imminent national ruin, obedience becomes complicity, necessitating moral courage to resist irrespective of loyalty to oaths or traditions. The implications derived from the tragedies of Germany's cities, the countless graves of war victims, and the horrors of concentration camps underscored the peril of military professionalism lacking a moral foundation. Effective war-making devoid of wisdom concerning its cessation culminates not in glory, but in disaster.
The narrative surrounding why Hitler's generals continued to fight after 1943 underscores the limitations of military professionalism as a moral guide. It illustrates how loyalty to institutions, adherence to authority, and a sense of professional pride can persist even when such motivations lead to irrational outcomes and significant suffering. The story demonstrates that expertise in military tactics does not inherently equate to wisdom in deciding when to cease combat. Importantly, the most perilous military leaders are those who possess both skill and bravery, yet lack the moral courage to question orders that should be contested. The German generals, despite their military prowess, became complicit in genocide, displaying bravery without the moral fortitude necessary to terminate the conflict. They were strategists, capable of understanding the futility of their actions, but were trapped by their professional identities, failing to recognize that certain wars, once initiated, may become immoral to continue regardless of one's obligations. By 1943, the recognition that Germany had lost the war should have prompted unilateral action to halt hostilities. Instead, it resulted in an additional 28 months of senseless violence. This scenario remains one of the most troubling legacies of World War II, serving as a cautionary tale about the perils of military professionalism disconnected from ethical reasoning and the consequences of uncritically following orders when they warrant scrutiny.